The wind howled across the dusty plains as Mary stepped off the old bus, clutching her worn handbag to her chest. She was a widow, still young but carrying exhaustion far beyond her years. Her husband's sudden death had left her buried in debt, with no relatives to turn to and no home of her own. When she learned that the wealthy but reclusive rancher, Mr. Jonathan Hayes, was hiring someone to clean his barn for minimum pay, she didn't hesitate. It was the only job left in town that nobody else wanted. The ranch was massive, acres of golden fields and endless wooden fences stretching toward the horizon. But despite its beauty, there was a heaviness in the air, a silence that felt almost intentional. Locals whispered that ever since his wife died 3 years ago, the rancher had become cold, distant, and heartless. He cared only about work, and about protecting his young twins, Noah and Ellie. Mary arrived at the big red barn just as the sun dipped low. The barn doors creaked open, and there stood Jonathan Hayes, tall, stern-faced, and expressionless. His piercing blue eyes looked her over without a flicker of emotion. "You'll start at sunrise," he said flatly. "You clean the barn. Nothing more. You do not go near the main house, and you do not speak to my children." Mary nodded silently, though something in her heart ached at his final words. She had once dreamed of being a mother, a dream buried with her husband. But she needed this job. She needed to survive. She didn't yet know that fate had entirely different plans. The next morning, Mary rose before dawn, her hands raw from scrubbing and lifting hay bales. The smell of dust and feed filled her lungs, but she kept working, determined not to fail. The barn was enormous, with shadows that seemed to move like silent spectators. She hummed quietly to herself, trying to stay calm in the strange, quiet ranch. By mid-morning, she had stacked hay, cleaned stalls, and swept the floor until it shone. Wiping the sweat from her brow, she turned to check on the corner where the youngest animals slept. And that's when she saw it, a soft rustling beneath a pile of old blankets. Curious, she moved closer. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Nestled under the blankets were 2 tiny, fragile bodies, infant twins, a boy and a girl, fast asleep, clutching each other. Tears pricked Mary's eyes. How had no one told her the children were here in the barn? Before she could think, a shadow fell across her. Jonathan Hayes stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his stern expression unchanging. "They were sleeping," he said softly, a rare trace of vulnerability in his voice. I didn't expect anyone to see them." Mary swallowed hard, glancing at the innocent little faces. "They're so tiny, and they need someone," she whispered. Jonathan looked away, his jaw tight. "You're not supposed to touch them." Yet as Mary reached gently toward the twins, cradling them instinctively, she felt something stir deep in her heart, a connection she hadn't felt in years, and one she couldn't ignore. The barn job had just become something far more important than she could have imagined. Mary stayed frozen for a moment, the twins resting safely in her arms. Jonathan remained silent, but the tight line of his jaw betrayed an inner struggle. It was the first time she had ever seen a softer side of him, one hidden beneath years of grief and isolation. "They're cold," Mary said softly, adjusting the blankets around the infants. "They need warmth. I can keep them safe for a few minutes." Jonathan's piercing gaze softened, though he quickly masked it with a stern expression. "5 minutes," he said firmly. Then they returned to their cribs. "You understand?" Mary nodded. "I understand." As she rocked the twins gently, a strange calm settled over the barn. The morning sunlight filtered through the high windows, painting golden streaks across the wooden walls. She hummed a quiet lullaby, one her own mother had taught her, and the twins stirred slightly, their tiny fingers curling around her hands. Jonathan lingered near the doorway, silent yet attentive. He had never shared this kind of intimacy with anyone, yet something about Mary's presence felt different, gentle, caring, instinctive. His hands, calloused from years of ranch work, itched to help, but he stayed still, watching. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt the weight of his solitude lift, replaced by a quiet, fragile hope. Mary glanced up at him and caught the unspoken words, "Trust." And though neither of them said it aloud, both knew this moment had crossed a line. The barn, once just a place of chores, had become the unexpected beginning of something neither of them could have anticipated. Over the next few days, Mary's routine continued in the barn, but everything had changed. She no longer saw the job as mere cleaning and chores, It had become a sanctuary for the twins, and gradually, for herself. Every morning, she arrived before sunrise, cradling Noah and Ellie, singing soft lullabies while the barn's wooden walls echoed her gentle voice. Jonathan watched from a distance at first, careful not to interfere. Yet every time he saw Mary hold the twins, a strange warmth stirred in him. He caught himself smiling when they cooed or gurgled, a sound he hadn't heard in years. One morning, he brought fresh blankets without a word, placing them in the corner of the barn. Mary noticed, her lips curving into a grateful smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice catching slightly. Jonathan merely nodded, turning away before she could read the vulnerability in his eyes. By the end of the week, the twins had begun to recognize her. They reached for Mary's hands and giggled when she tickled their tiny feet. Jonathan found himself lingering longer in the barn each morning, drawn by a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in years. Protection. Care. Something deeper that went beyond mere responsibility. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Mary cleaned the last stall and looked at Jonathan. "They're happy," she said softly. "They deserve happiness," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. In that silent moment, they both realized the barn had transformed, not just into a place of work, but into the beginning of a fragile, beautiful bond. Days turned into weeks, and the barn was no longer just a place of labor. It had become a home filled with laughter, warmth, and gentle routines. Mary had grown accustomed to the early mornings, the soft coos of Noah and Ellie, and the quiet companionship of Jonathan. The rancher, once cold and distant, now lingered near the barn, finding excuses to check on the twins or assist Mary with chores. One crisp morning, as Mary rocked Ellie in her arms, Jonathan stepped closer. I didn't think I'd ever feel this again," he admitted, his voice low but steady. "Not since their mother," his words trailed off, leaving an unspoken grief hanging in the air. Mary placed a hand on his arm, offering comfort without words. "They're alive. They're safe. And we can give them the love they deserve," she said gently. Jonathan nodded, swallowing hard. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. The twins stirred, reaching for both Mary and Jonathan, binding the three of them together in a fragile, unbreakable connection. From that moment, the ranch no longer felt lonely. The barn had transformed from a place of chores into a sanctuary of trust and love. Mary's heart, once burdened by grief, now brimmed with a new purpose. Jonathan's life, long defined by loss, had begun to open to possibilities he hadn't dared imagine. Together, they became a family, not just by circumstance, but by choice, laughter, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most extraordinary lives. The barn, once only a place of work, had become the cradle of hope, love, and new beginnings.